Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Raw Men. And this is going to be a fun one. Today, I'm talking to Kendal Sheets. Now, Kendal has kind of accidentally discovered something questionable about the origin of the Church of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. Now, of course, we've already seen lots of spurious accusations or accusations of spurious origin on the part of the Mormons, but he's found something new and different. So, Kendal Sheets, how do you do, sir?
Hello, how are you doing, Arm?
It's all right. It's all right. So give me a bit of the backstory before you lead into your discovery, as it were.
Okay, backstory list is two parts. Who are the Mormons? The Mormons are a religion with different sects, and there's the main one I would call the largest one are the Latter-day Saints, and they're in Salt Lake City, and they claim 12 to 20 million members, depending on which person you talk to. There's also an independent group in Missouri, and they're called Church of Christ, and they probably have 500,000 members, up to 1 million, again, depending on who you ask. And then there's other various sects. There's the fundamentalists, which you've seen have made the news. Mr. Warren Jeffs is the leader of that. Now he's serving, I think, 20 years in prison for sexual abuse of minors. Basically, he married 50 underage girls, and that's not real acceptable in the United States today. So like Joseph Smith, he was also arrested and imprisoned. We're pretty much doing the same thing. And there's various, these organizations are spread throughout the world. So what happened was back in, go ahead.
I was going to say, L. Ron Hubbard mentioned something about if you wanted to get rich, the best way to do that was to start a religion. But it seems we've got multiple examples that if you just really want to have a whole collection or a harem of really young girls, then starting a religion is another way around that too.
That's exactly right. So,
and certainly, if you want to be above the law somehow and still treated as though you're both simultaneously righteous despite your obvious sin, and that you are some sort of an expert in wisdom and morality, despite the fact that you just made all this up.
That's right. and so Joseph Smith, to the core of it, he made all this up. He how it started was. He started they wrote a book and then started a religion, and then it turned to sex. So it turned to marrying other men, sleeping with other men's wives and marrying underage girls, and this polygamy. But what we did was we basically deconstructed the core of the Mormon religion, which is the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon was allegedly written by Joseph Smith. It was published in 1830, and he claimed that. And when he's 14, 15 years old, he was laying back one day, and this angel appeared in his bedroom and said, "Hey, I know where a book is on gold plates, and these gold plates have the history of the Native American Indians on this continent. And if you go out to this hillside, which is outside Rochester, New York, dig it up, you'll have the lost Bible, and of Jesus visiting America, and the new religion, that the lost religious practices that are not in the Bible." So he said he did that. And then what he said he did was he actually went out and found these gold plates, took them and then hid them in a tree, and then didn't take the gold plates to see what was written on them, but went back to a friend of his and placed this stone called a Seer Stone, which is a magic stone, and put it into his hat. And then he could see what was written on the Book of Mormon on the plates in his hat. And he read it off, wrote it down, and I'm not making any of this up, Arm. That's exactly what happened. So basically,
I'm just going to say, yeah, sure, sounds legit.
Sure, yeah, why not? So back in 1987, 86, 87 time frame, a couple Mormons. My father's living out in Wyoming. A couple Mormons came to his door. Maybe maybe they come to your door. They come to a lot of people's doors.
They don't come to my door anymore.
Okay. Get them off. Gave him Book of Mormon, and they had a slide projector, and they sat down. He said, "Sure, I want to see what's this thing all about." And they said, basically, one of the things they said was there were elephants in America 2,000 years ago. Well, my father, being a chemical engineer, expert in math, expert in science, he's also an amateur archaeologist. And we're from Oklahoma. And in Oklahoma happens to be one of the best places in the world to dig up Ice Age animals, because it was on the verge of the ice cap. And so he's dug up mastodons, which are what we call elephants. They're the Ice Age elephants, saber-toothed tigers, etc. So, and the Mormons, these Mormon, young, nice Mormon missionaries, they said, oh yeah, the elephants were here 2,000 years ago. My father said, oh, that's impossible because I've dug them up. They died out 10,000 years ago and we radiocarbon dated them. There were no elephants 2,000 years ago. And so it's basically science that was wrong in the Book of Mormon is what started this whole venture. So he started reading this Book of Mormon. He read it cover to cover a few times. And he said, these sound familiar, something strange, these names, these battles. And he started pulling all these history books off the shelf. He has books of old books of Central America, books about Asia. He's very well read. And he got to the book of the Travels of Marco Polo. And so he started flipping through that. Well, lo and behold, he found that there were similar names, same stories. And basically, after a few years, he had found that the stories and the names, the Travels of Marco Polo, tracked by percentage where they were in the Book of Mormon. So this isn't just a case of plagiarism. It's a case of mathematical certainty where you can find a name or story or event in the Book of Mormon as a percent through the book. So it's not page by page because there's 588 pages in the original 1830 version of the Book of Mormon. And there's 788 pages in this book. So this book is an original book of Marco Polo published in 1818. And this was published in London. It's called Travels of Marco Polo by editor William Marsden. And it was this book, he found that if you take a percent, for example, if you open each book at 33%, the Book of Mormon, this book, within 2, 3, 4, maximum maybe 5%, you'll find a similar story, similar name, this name called Manji in this book. And Manji was a southern land in China that Marco Polo visited. If you open the Book of Mormon, you'll find at the same percent or close to that same percent, a southern city, what's called the Nephites of the ancient Mormon people, was named Manti. So what they did was they took a name called Manji for a southern land. Joseph Smith used it at the same place, though, in the book for a land called Manti. So you can test this. We call it percent through the text procedure. So you can open the Book of Marco Polo, let's say 66%, 2/3 of the way through. This was my test. And open the Book of Mormon, 2/3 of the way through, and start reading back and forth. Within less than 2% of the pages, you'll find a story about soldiers. They were in a walled city. They were getting drunk. Other soldiers came and slayed them. The one story said they could have slain them. Basically, it's the same story.
Are we talking about something like, let's say, Game of Thrones, for example, supposedly based on this other series of books where the Lannisters in one story are the Lancasters in another story, but it's essentially the same story. This is what you're saying is going on here.
It's similar to that. So it's beyond plagiarism. It's digging deep into the stories. Now, so he found this, and one interesting thing is the Travels of Marco Polo took place in Middle East and Asia, right? There's nothing over here in America. Now, the story of the Book of Mormon is that there's this Hebrew family in Jerusalem, 600 BC. They sailed over to America. They call that the Promised Land, and landed somewhere in Central America, started this city called Zarahemla. Well, there's these two tribes. This father, Lehi, he had 4 sons. One son was called Nephi, which there's this group called the Nephites, and one called Laman, called the Lamanites. And after a while, they grew in these big tribes and started fighting and killing each other. But in these stories, all these wars and battles took place over here in America. Well, what Joseph Smith did was he took the Book of Marco Polo as an outline and the Tatars battling all of the other enemies as stories as if they took place in America. But he also mixed it in with the stories of the conquest of Mexico. So this is not the only book. And so like the Game of Thrones, where we're taking pieces from other stories, he conglomerated probably over 20 different books and records into the Book of Mormon. And this is a fallacy people all through, since it was published 1830, people are trying to figure out, where did this book come from? He copied something. They're all looking for one book. It's not one book. So in my in my book, I have a graph showing he took not only travels of Marco Polo, but in the early 1800s were published these travels and history books, and one by Robert Kerr, and one by this English editor Robert Kerr, English editor John Pinkerton, James Duncan, Modern Traveler, published 1825. What they did was they took stories that were published around the world in other languages. They went and collected them all over Europe. Some are in Arabic, some are in Spanish, Italian, French, other languages, translated all those in English and published them in basically encyclopedias, right? Because back then there was no internet. People didn't know what's going on in the history of Africa or the history of, in the Holy Land. Well, one of these stories was called Conquest of Mexico by Bernal Diaz, who was one of the soldiers under Cortez. And he wrote a story published in Spanish in the late 1500s. It was never published in English until it went into one of these books. And now we got the detailed story of what happened down when Cortez invaded Mexico and fought the Aztecs. What Joseph Smith did is very clever. He took the white Spanish soldiers with steel swords and horses and advanced technology, and couched those as this group called the Nephites in the Book of Mormon. And he took the Aztecs, who were the Indians, the idol worshippers, the human sacrificing, they had dark skin, and said, oh, God cursed the descendants of laymen with dark skin, and those became the Aztecs. Those are the Indians. Those are the bad darkies, we call them.
Of course, that's not the way.
Dark skin.
Yeah, of course, I've heard Mormon missionaries recount that a little bit differently.
Yeah,
they don't think it's Native Americans, but this is why blacks were not allowed in the Mormon church until like 1977.
That's exactly right. They weren't allowed in the priesthood, so it rise to higher levels because they were they were descendants of the Lamanites, where they had the curse of God, the dark skin, and that's where this came from. So he took those stories of Mexico and other stories of contemporary history written from geographers and others who'd been to Mexico, and about cities and battles and armaments and chariots and riding horses. So he wrote there were horses 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago. The tame horses. He wrote there's chariots, that there's elephants. Well, those weren't there. The Spanish brought all those. The Europeans brought all those. Why would he write that? Because he was copying, he was inserting not just the Mongols who rode on horses and had chariots, but Cortez and this invasion. So it was very, very clever what they did. Now, what drove this? What was the interest in this? Well, back in the early 1800s, there's a lot of interest in where the Indians come from, how the Native American Indians get here. Were they a lost Jewish tribe? They were the Jews. And there's all these things comparing the Indian tribes to the Jews in the newspapers. I have copies of newspapers.
You've got newspaper clippings of people in the 1800s before Joseph Smith made this up.
Yes.
Where people were comparing Native Americans to Jews.
Yes. In his area, in the upstate New York, out of Rochester, in his region. I'm
just confused as to how anybody sees a similarity there.
I don't know. They looked at the language, their religious practices. I don't know. It's quite a stretch. So what? But he came up with he was the answer man. Came up with all the answers. So how he started this, why he was so good, I call him one of the world's greatest con men. So he was very good at convincing people to believe he had magical powers. So this started with, before the Book of Mormon came about, he was actually what we call gold diggers or treasure hunters. So he had a company of a group of men with him. He was part of a company, and he claimed that he had this magic stone called the Seer Stone. Now the Salt Lake City branch, the LDS, they still have some of his Seer Stones, and I saw it actually on display over here at Library of Congress. They brought it down here. And he claimed to be able to see in the spirit world and gain knowledge by looking through this stone, this mystical knowledge. What they do, they go around and say, oh, I have a stone. I see through my stone in the spirit world, and you have a gold mine under your property. Or I've seen the spirit world, and there's a buried Indian treasure. It's full of silver. It's under your land somewhere. And if you give me some money, me and my buddies will come and dig it up for you. And so they went digging up all over upstate New York, all over the place, all the way to Pennsylvania, and conning all these farmers out of their money. He was actually convicted. One of his victims brought him to court. I think it was out in Pennsylvania. And there's a court record where he actually confessed that he couldn't see anything and never found a treasure. So, but what he did, he took that and he parlayed that into creating this Book of Mormon by saying, the story I just told you, I have these plates and I can see into the spirit world. And by using my stone, I can see a translation of what's written on these gold plates. And he found a few believers and they believed him. And he claimed that became the Book of Mormon.
One of the things that I am most confused about is, why people want to maintain a belief in something that they now know is not true. I mean, I get when I give something that disproves a position solidly, I get people really upset. They always want to hear some excuse for how you can't prove it wrong, so they can continue to pretend that it's right. They don't need evidence that it's right, but you can't ever have evidence that it's wrong.
Right.
And the very idea that Joseph Smith had been convicted of criminally duping people with these seer stones in the hat and all of this, that he then bases a religion on that. I've had Mormons tell me that conviction never happened, that's all propaganda that was made up later.
There's court record of it. It's there.
But you hear the excuses, right? Because I mean, it doesn't matter how obvious it is that they were duped. I just don't understand how they would how you can cherish a belief so much that you wouldn't let your mind be changed. And I've just never experienced that, because I mean, all my life, I mean, I would think that, okay, things are a certain way, and then I would discover the data that shows that, oh, what I thought was wrong. Okay, well, look at this, I'm wrong. I now have to change my mind. It never crosses my mind that somebody else would find the data that shows that they're wrong and then persevere through that. But I've met believers who won't.
I've met, obviously, so three-part answer to your question. I take lots of hate mail. I know it's surprising. I'm somewhere between Satan incarnate, the son of Satan, and some of them want to cut my tongue out before they ban me to hell. Actual Mormons, on my website, on my Facebook page, but and that doesn't bother me. It's fine. I'm an attorney. I'm used to dealing with lots of negative comments. It's almost like there's two things for people born into any religion, and maybe Mormons more so. If you've been told your whole life this is how it is, then how can it be wrong? And you've been duped, and everyone you know is wrong. So it's I think it may be a group thing. If your conversion, and they make them live by a very strict code, which is what a lot of groups like this do. So they keep very strict mind control, very strict monetary control. You're forced to give money, or you won't go to heaven. But again, why won't they open their minds? I've had some feedback from a few Mormons who've written me that they did leave the church because of my book. So, but I think they're just too scared, because everyone they know is in this religion, their family. Oh, and it's also, if you leave, you're banished.
Yeah.
You lose your family, you lose your friends. And I've known people that have had to leave the state.
Yeah, not just with Mormons. I know people in more or that are less restrictive, not like Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, where we know that this is common practice, but in other Protestant religions where you don't expect to see this happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I know somebody that's simply expressing that, they figured out that they're not a creationist anymore because they understand that evolution is an actual thing that really happened. And then suddenly that's enough to have the entire community ostracize them. And suddenly you're very questionable. Suddenly you can't hold a job or be elected or cases here in Texas is particularly bad. I get lots of reports about, people going into child custody cases. If you're identified as an unbeliever, well, then, that's a mark against you for child custody. That's how obscene that is.
It's terrible. Imagining you're in Utah. We knew someone when I lived part of the time out with my father when we were creating this. We knew someone, we showed him our basic research, and he was a Mormon. He left, had to leave the state, and he went and started a donut business. He was an engineer. He started absolutely over. Presenting the what you said, Aaron, about presenting the facts. So I have in my book, people have said, I've taken lots of some criticism, say, oh, it's plagiarism. Yeah, lots of people said it's similar stories, and so what? Who cares? You know, you can't prove all this plagiarism. What we did was we found the numbers in the book of Marco Polo also were tracked by the numbers in the Book of Mormon. And so what do I mean by numbers? We have some tables. So for example, so if you look at the beginning of each book, 1 to 3% of the way, at the very, very beginning of the book, there are sets of brothers, and they take 4 trips back and forth to Jerusalem. This is how both stories start out. One is the Polo brothers, Marco Polo's uncle and his father. And then it's these brothers, Nephi and Laman, the sons of Lehi. The Polo brothers took 4 trips back and forth from Acre, which one of the holy city near Jerusalem. And in the Book of Mormon, it's to Jerusalem. So that's the number 4 at the beginning of this book. What we did was we tracked in this table, for example, 4 to 5%, there's the number 600 shows up. At 8 and 9%, again, this number 600 years. At 8% Marco Polo and 9% Book of Mormon. At 29%, there's a number 40 days journey and 40 days wandered. At 29% exactly in each book, if you calculate it by the page numbers. And he did this, Smith did this, continuing all throughout this Book of Mormon. And we wonder why. Well, if you say, oh, plagiarism, Manti's not like Manji, and these names aren't like other names, we can't, the numbers don't lie. You can't make up numbers. We have the number 2,000 soldiers in a garrison and 2,000 guards at the number 64% exactly. So why did he do this? Because if you're writing a story about historical travels and armies and large armies and doing battles, well, nobody knows. He didn't know what the right size of armies, what the right size of how many people died or how many people were there. So he just followed the actual numbers from Marco Polo. What's interesting about this, again, is solid proof that we know he used this exact 1818 Marco Polo book. There is a footnote at page 577 in Marco Polo about 240,000 Tatars invading Japan. And this was a disastrous invasion. Most of the only battle they ever lost. Japanese just decimated them. There's a big storm, and they couldn't even get on the island. At 90% in the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith wrote that 240,000 Nephites died at the battle at the hands of the Lamanites. All right, so this exact number, 240,000, the number of soldiers. Well, what's interesting in this book from 1818, that's a footnote written by editor William Marsden. It was not as actual history that he added to it. And it was not written by Marco Polo. And that's how we know it was actually this book. And I have other clues and other places and other words out of the footnotes here that were inserted into the Book of Mormon.
Outstanding. So on top of that particular edition of that book, you said you've identified a handful of other specific works.
Correct.
That were integrated into that. Do you have some of those other titles?
I do. It's, let me get my notes here. One is this editor, Robert Kerr. There we go, Modern Traveler. I don't know if anyone can see it. This is called.
Okay, yep.
You see that? Modern Traveler Arabia. Popular description of the various countries of the globe. Printed in London by James Duncan, published 1825. Now, this is a 24-volume set. One is Modern Traveler Mexico and Guatemala. Smith also copied out of that. This Arabia and all other countries. So this was like an encyclopedia of travels. And there's also contemporaneous geography and history. So another one was Robert Kerr. It's called A General History and Collection of Voyages and Travels. And that was published between 1806 to 1811, as well as an editor named John Pinkerton, also published in London between the years 1806 to about 1812. So these are three of the main volume sets. And in my book, I have a slide with, there are others, but these are the few others. These are primary ones. So these stories, for example, in Mexico and Guatemala, we have maps of Mexico. We have maps of Mexico City with pyramids. We have maps of temples. Another one's by Charles Cullen. And that was, he wrote The History of Mexico. That was a translation from Clavijero, one of the famous Spanish priests down there who took a history. He's got Mexican paintings in there. He's got Mexican drawings of soldiers, of the calendar, of the priests. And Charles Cullen was a lawyer in Philadelphia in the early 1800s. So these books were available here, and they were also available as imports from England. And so he took these stories out. So another claim Smith made. This is good. So he had the Book of Mormon said that there's buildings and cities and pyramids and technology and trade and mines and iron and steel. And then he was handed a book in the 1840s that was also written by some explorers looking at the Mayan temples in the Yucatan. And Smith wrote an op-ed in their Mormon newspaper called Times and Seasons. And he said, oh, look, this confirms the findings of the Book of Mormon. See, I was right. Who knew? Who knew these things were down there? And the LDS Church in Salt Lake City actually still has that book. And I saw it on display here in DC in the museum. They still say, oh my God, he didn't know. He really did see an angel. Because look, someone later found it. Well, no, this is all in these books in the early 1800s, 20 years before, 30 years. In fact, I have school books from U.S. schools in the New England talking about the pyramids, the history, the religion down in Mexico. So this was actually even taught in grade school at the time.
This reminds me, once upon a time I was on a debate with a young Earth creationist who said he had all of this evidence of pre-Columbian dinosaurs,
okay,
discovered in North America. And I said, okay, give me an example of the best, the one example that your readers can, once this debate is over, they can look it up themselves and they'll see that it's absolutely confirmed what you're saying. What's the best, the best example they can look up and know? And so he gave this example of these swords that were discovered in, I guess, New Mexico, and they had Hebrew writing on them, and they had drawings of dinosaurs, like a drawing of a sauropod on one of them, with all this Hebrew script and everything. And so these were supposed to have been from, 700 years ago or whatever. So these are before Columbus. And when I looked at it, as soon as that debate was over, I had to look that thing up myself. And what it turned out to be was the swords were made of lead. They were decorative wall hanging pieces.
Okay.
At the dinosaurs, the sauropod that was drawn on it had a forked tongue coming out, because that was back when people thought that dinosaurs were lizards.
Right.
Yeah, and so now we know, of course, that wouldn't have been the case. But then also the Hebrew text that was written on the swords turned out to have been quoted verbatim from a book on how to speak Hebrew.
Right.
and the swords weren't even discovered. They were kind of like put into an archaeological dig where they were already digging, and they just like shoved them down there and then dumped and piles or moved sand over them.
Wow.
So they obviously didn't belong there.
Yeah.
So this was something that had been exposed as an embarrassingly stupid hoax in the 1930s. Yet Bob Dutko said this was the absolute best proof he had that people could confirm that he was right. And what you're telling me now is something so painfully similar to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I could relate this to so many people that I can think of off the top of my head, that this kind of thing would destroy them, and I'd see the excuses and backpedaling and the outrage. And unfortunately, I'm already banned from that part of my family, so.
Going back to what you said about I think the closed-mindedness, and I'm looking up something else to show you that is going to be that parlays into what you're just saying about the writing. I think the closed-mindedness comes it's the culture, but they don't want to, you know, are you going to admit that you were fooled? That you believed in something so ridiculous, so easily provable wrong. And so let's just entrench our position and say, no, I know it's true. I know it's true. It's got to be true. Just keep repeating that. You know, I'm not here. I don't hate Mormons. I've worked for and with Mormons before. I've had Mormon clients, and they're great people. Everyone I've interacted with has just been awesome in my professional life. So I'm not telling Mormons what to believe. I'm not telling anyone what to believe. I don't hate Mormons. I'm not out to get them. I don't have an axe to grind. We made a scientific discovery, and then we made a historical discovery. And I think this is part of American history. You've got Joseph Smith. You know, he ran for president. He was leader of thousands of people. He was Lieutenant General Smith in charge of the Mormon army. Most people don't realize. He rode around on a horse with a sword. And the Brigham Young, you know, they went out in the late 50s. They went out to Utah. They found it's called the State of Deseret, and then set up battles with the U.S. cavalry. They're called the Mormon Wars. You can go look this up. There's some.
I'm familiar. I was raised in a Mormon family, so I mean, I've heard quite a lot of that. I mean, and I'm aware. You know, one of the things that the Mormons have to their advantage, I mean, they know better than most other Christian denominations the value of the separation of church and state,
right?
Because they had the Mormon execution order issued on them, 1830s, I think it was, that it was not repealed until 1976.
That's correct.
So, yeah, but the next thing I want to ask is, you know, when you get this compilation of stories that you know, goes into this history of Mexico that is really China.
Yeah.
At what point did he find like early copies of John Carter, Warlord of Mars? I mean, where did we get the other planets from?
Right. Oh, the living on the other planets.
Yes.
All of that came in with Brigham Young. So Joseph Smith, you know, he was murdered, he was assassinated in I think 1846, and he and his brother Hiram. And after that, there was a power struggle within the church, basically, and Brigham Young kind of there's other books about that. There was almost like coup d'etat. It was supposed to be his young son take over, but Brigham Young took over. So Brigham Young then continued. Now, I can't tell from Brigham Young's writing whether he knew this was fake or not. And I didn't focus on that. I was focused on Book of Mormon, actual history books. But he wrote about, you know, I think he took Joseph Smith's writings. Smith had gone on to write something called Book of Abraham. And he claimed to translate an Egyptian papyrus. And basically, I tracked where that came from. It's also from this modern traveler, Arabia, that I just showed on the screen. He took names and stories out of, like Kolob. You've heard of the name Kolob. It's like this planet. Like, it's heaven and God lives on. And you'll get your own planet when you die. So Joseph Smith was going into this kind of spiritual writing, spiritual experience. Well, the name Kolob was the name of the head of a convent in the Holy Land, and that word is exactly out of the Modern Traveler Arabia by James Duncan. It's the only two places in the world in literature where that word appears. Or three places, I guess. My book, this 1825 book, and the Book of Mormon. So I trace that exactly.
So, but this Kolob, or however it's pronounced, this originated with Brigham Young.
That originated with Joseph Smith.
So he did. Okay.
Yeah, that was in the Book of Abraham, and he also wrote things about. He took pieces out about Muslims, about where did Muhammad come from? Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh tribe. He changed those words, plagiarized, put them into the Book of Abraham. So Muslims aren't going to like to hear that some of their teachings and writings come from actually Islam. So it just gets crazier. I think Brigham Young then took those and then just went nuts and said, "Oh yeah, Kolob's not just a planet that God lives on. You're going to get your own Kolob. You're going to get your own place. You're going to get your own." And he just kept going. All of a sudden, he's now the seer, the creator.
Yeah.
And I think that's where he just kind of went off on it.
And then they all adapted the ability to communicate directly with God, whatever God wants. The way that God has a tendency, we see this all the way back to Exodus, where God mandates exactly how the raiment of his priests are supposed to be bejeweled. You know,
Right.
all these details about, you know, how you will treat these people in accordance with the greatness that they possess or what have you.
Yeah.
I know believers in Mormonism who, you know, there's some crazy beliefs in Mormons, and then there are the crazy beliefs that Mormons have, and then there's some really crazy beliefs that only some Mormons have, and those are the special ones for me.
Right.
The ones that I think are the funniest are, but there's the common one that God has a body. And I remember being 14 years old and talking to the Mormon missionaries about this. And I said, okay, well, so God exists everywhere and every when throughout the multiverse. I mean, he exists on every planet across time and deep space between time. And he has lungs.
Yeah.
And, and his arms only reach this far.
Yeah.
What does he do with this body? Does he keep it under a tarp in the garage? I mean, when would he need it? And then the other beliefs that how did they make the voyage from Jerusalem to South America? Because one of the stories that some Mormons have told me is that they used submarines.
Okay. This comes. It's two things. This comes. The story of the submarines are called barges, and that was added in this book called the Book of Ether on the end. There was a book published in 1827, and I've got all the documentation in my book. So what happened was they were writing this Book of Mormon script. It started with this family in 600 BC, the Leah and Sarai, his wife. And this book published in 1827, and the author's name's Ranking, and he posited, his theory was that the Aztecs and the Incas were actually lost soldiers from this failed invasion of Japan from the Tatars, and that I discussed earlier, because there was a what do they call them? Hurricane and the storm. They got the runoff course, and he compared the Aztecs and the Incas rulers and the names and the history with the Tatars. And he used actually some of this 1818 Marco Polo book in this 1827 book. Well, what he said was, he wrote also about these, they call them barges that the Chinese would use to float up and down the river. And they in their canals for shipping and for people transport in the Tatar kingdom and in China, in modern China at the time. Well, Joseph Smith took that as in these Jaredites. He said, oh, the Jaredites came from the Tower of Babel in actually 2000 BC. And the Jaredites were blown across the ocean, and they went in barges. What he did was he described these same barges that were in this book by John Rankin. And he described these people that were blown over and became, and according to his theory, the Mongols became the Aztecs. And so what this Book of Ether is, it's combining that story at the very end as a prequel to the actual Book of Mormon with the Nephites and Lamanites that we know. And so it was just an add-on, and that's a real giveaway because it's so obvious now. And I've got in my book the tables tracing the stories, the descriptions out of this John Rankin book thrown in at the end of the Book of Mormon. But that's what you're talking about. They're not submarines. But what they did was they said there was no windows. It was like the Ark. Like there's no windows, there's no doors, and they were just flopping around in the ocean, and God's breath blew them the promised land. You know? So that's basically where it came from.
Okay, so it was related to me that it was submarines,
Yeah.
but you know, this came from the same people who told me also, and you're going to love this. And I bet you can't find the origin for this one. The idea that Adam and Eve, it pre-existed on the Garden of Eden, was actually the planet Nibiru.
Okay.
It's on the other side of the sun. That's why we can't see it. Except for one time when it suddenly flew all the way to our side and got so close to the earth that Adam and Eve jumped here.
Yeah.
From there. So when you're capable of believing something like that, I'm not even going to make an effort to try to explain why these other things can't be true.
Yeah. How do you even begin to speak to someone who believes something like that?
Now, you know what I want to see? I want to see you on stage with, or on a podcast with David Fitzgerald. Are you familiar with him?
Yes, I'm in touch with him.
You two would be so fun.
Yeah. I'm sending him one. I'm sending him one of my books now in the process. He's going to
Okay. Well, when you guys do a podcast together, that's going to be a hoot. You guys really need to do that.
All right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to show you something really funny. And this is what Joseph Smith was so good at getting people to believe. Okay. Now I told you about these gold plates and they have hieroglyphics on them, right? Now after Book of Mormon was published, people were desperate saying, oh, show us the hieroglyphics. Show us the hieroglyphics. Right. And he wouldn't show them the gold plates. What he did was he wrote this document. He called it characters. He wrote this really weird symbols on it. And this is a copy of the actual one that he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
I found online. And this always bothered me. The whole time we worked on this book 25 years. And I saw this on time and I thought, that's got to come from somewhere. This guy did not have one original idea. Everything he did was plagiarized and copied. This is actually a flyer for the Book of Mormon, an actual one that has some of these hieroglyphics on it. Again, claiming, that's the Book of Mormon stuff. Where'd this come from? So one of these books I told you about is called The General Collection of Best and Most Interesting Voyages and Travels in All Parts of the World, Volume 1, by Longman, London, and Hurst, published 1808 in Philadelphia. Okay, the first 6 volumes by Kimber and Conrad. This is this guy, John Pinkerton. It's also published in London, but they republished in Philadelphia. This is a book about the Laplanders. Laplanders were a native tribe in Northern Europe. This is called the Laplander Magical Drum. And I saw this one, oh my God. Let's blow it up. Look at the symbols. Okay. And lo and behold, this is a table right out of my book. I compare each of these symbols to each of those ones that Joseph Smith drew. He copied the Laplander drum as the holy hieroglyphics on the gold plates that became the Book of Mormon. Now, the ironic thing, Aaron, is that this Laplander drum, if you read the story, this is a shaman. He beats on this drum and goes into a trance, and he passes out. And when he passes out, he speaks to the devil, and he gets instructions from the devil. And then he goes and tells his tribe what to do. And that's this Laplander drum. So these symbols actually are his means of communication to Satan, what they called Satan for the Laplander.
So what you've got is a very compelling case against any hope of perpetuating Mormonism. I can understand why, a whole host of people would be upset at you for this.
Oh yeah,
this is pretty damning. I don't know I've seen some damning statements made of other religions or Christianity in general. I've seen a lot of compelling evidence to the appropriate word, bogosity, shall we say, of some of the beliefs, but never to this degree. You've got Scientology level debunking going on here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious what's going to happen to this industry, this Mormon industry within 10 or 20 years. What could possibly be left of it after something like that, after this book?
That's a very good word, industry. And you're familiar with Mormonism. I am. Anyone who doesn't know, this is an industry. They own everything from thousands of acres of farms to manufacturing plants to shopping malls. I always want to question, Mormons, do you know where your money goes? You want to buy a shopping mall? Come on.
I was in a few towns close to the Four Corners area of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to a few towns where basically, if you're not Mormon, you don't have a job.
Right.
They control whole communities out there.
Yeah.
And the way that they pay their tithe, I've known people, they're only supposed to give 10% of their net, but they give 10% of the gross. And then they give more when things get more desperate because they believe that they're paying for blessings.
Right. Yeah. It's
the worse their situation is, the worse their situation gets, because the more of their money they need, the more they give to the church to try to magically bail themselves out of some predicament.
Right.
It's all pretty.
I'm sorry. If they don't, they don't go to the celestial heaven, the highest level of heaven. So
Yeah, and then they have that thing about, if you once you're married in this life, then you remain married forever in heaven.
yes,
As if there would be any need for that. I mean, my grandmother,
yeah,
one of her dying wishes was to get a divorce from my grandfather so that she wouldn't be married to him forever.
I love that woman. The religion. What's interesting, well, the religion of the Mormons. They say, "Oh, we're just like Christianity. We have Jesus. We worship Jesus and God, just like Christians." Well, what they don't say is that they have a lot of weird beliefs that seem like Eastern beliefs. They have easily identified polygamy. That's an Eastern Asian belief. They believe in different levels of heaven, celestial heaven and terrestrial heaven. And that's an Eastern belief. They have beliefs like you stay married in heaven, things like this. So where do those come from? Well, Marco Polo, when he's traveling around, he recorded the history of the Tatars, other tribes. So he recorded the religious beliefs. They had this own, it wasn't straight Buddhism. They had kind of their own shamanistic, sort of a custom mix of Buddhism and Taoism and these other isms. One of their beliefs was states that you can be married in heaven. An interesting part of it is if your children died before they're married, they would actually have a marriage ceremony where they would marry their dead children and they would be married in heaven. This is the Tatars under Kublai Khan. This is recorded in Marco Polo. That is exactly the ceremony that the Mormons, at least in Salt Lake City, they do that. They have the exact same belief. They also believe you can give, help others who don't believe, who've already died, and this is why they have baptisms for the dead, things like this. But these religious beliefs, polygamy in Book of Mormon, actually in some of the called Doctrine and Covenants, which is another kind of a guidebook that Joseph Smith claimed to write. It copies out of the Book of Marco Polo about the polygamy and other things like this. So he's taken all this out of the Tatar beliefs. So the reason some of these beliefs sound Eastern is because they're copied from the Tatars, which I thought was interesting that your grandmother recognized that.
Did you get any sort of endorsement from, I don't know, outside scholarship on this? I mean, where other people, similarly moved or compelled to say, "Wow, you really happened on something here. This is the thing that will just shut Mormonism down completely."
You would think what it is it sent everyone scattering, running away. This book is this book is like dynamite. I mean, kryptonite. No one wants near it. Either the Christians, I guess they're afraid that this is going to upset the Mormons, and now we're supposed to get along with them. Of course, the Mormons don't want anything to do with it. Mormon Church. They've sent their minions out on the internet to try and just criticize me and say it's just plagiarism. He didn't prove anything, without actually reading or citing facts.
But so there aren't any scholars in any relevant field then that have come forward to say that, hey, you've actually got something, because a lot of people will not pay attention to the data itself. They have to have an authority back that data.
Right.
Which I don't understand why that is, because I mean, I was never that way. I'm not that way now. You're telling me this, and it's the information. If there was an authority that told me that Mormonism was be disproved, okay, fine. So he said that, but what is the data that did it? Because I'm still going to want the data, not the authority.
Right. Well, what we're actually doing now is I'm going to work with a professor of statistics at a local university here, and possibly other professors, and we're going to come up with a statistical analysis based on plagiarism. So there's a software now at colleges that can detect plagiarism, and I want to use that to study how he plagiarized this and do a statistical analysis of this percent for the text procedure, of how closely he tracked these other books, what was used. And so I think with getting some of these, instead of having just someone say, "Oh yeah, this book's good," everyone's going to want to see the data. Everyone wants to see it. Well, I've got the text. I've got everything. I'm not a statistician. I'm an engineer. I took calculus. I took a lot of math, but I'm not an expert in studying plagiarism or statistics like this. So we're going to get some experts at the science level, and I believe that will raise the level of curiosity among not just Mormons, or not just Christians, and not just general population. I think everyone, because then they'll start paying attention to that. Oh yeah, he shows this, but wow, he's got an expert in this.
Yeah, and you kind of need that in order to reach the public anymore. What would you do with that additional information? Would that be included in a second edition, or would that be a completely different subsequent book? How would that be presented?
I think it could be a second edition included in it.
Because that's what I would think too. Just the additional data, because it doesn't hurt when your book is really fat.
Right. Yeah. The book is 600 pages. There's a couple of problems. It's 600 pages. No one wants to read it. And believe me, Aaron, I cut out about a third of this is like 2/3 of what I have. A lot more research, and I had to whack this down to 600 pages. So,
well, why did you have to do that?
Because that was the limit. Me and my editor just said, look, this is people aren't going to. It's so thick now. People are going to have a hard time reading it. I wanted to.
But if you've got all this data that is just continuing to compound this case,
yeah,
I would think that anybody that had any doubts is going to want all of that additional.
Oh yeah, my plan was to just write that up and publish it on my website, just as papers. Like, here's additional research, and that requires an immense amount of time and immense amount of work to put all that together, even from my notes. And this book was hard enough. I've got hundreds and hundreds of footnotes. I took what I thought was the most compelling arguments.
Okay, fair enough. What is the title that you gave this book?
It's called Book of Mormon, Book of Lies. And people I've took criticism. Oh, it's incendiary. You're saying the Book of Mormon is a bunch of lies. And I looked at, what Joseph Smith said. He said that Christianity and people who believe in the Bible and the mainline Bible and not the Book of Mormon, they're being misled by Satan and the devil, and they're all going to hell. And he would actually, walk around town. The devil's misleading you because your Bible's wrong. And he was just direct to the point. So why don't I be direct to the point? It's just made up. It's a book of lies. I wanted something a little catchy, but people saying, why didn't you give a nicer title than more Mormons would read it? I said, well, I'm not here to be nice. I'm here to present the facts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I toyed with that, just trying to name this podcast, is this Mormon Polo? No, nobody's going to understand that. All right. Well, would you say that your book is at least an interesting read?
It's a very interesting read, and it's a very easy read. So this is my first full book I've ever done, but I'm an attorney and I have to write it all. I write everything from patents to legal briefs to everything. And so I have to write either very simply or very difficult.
It's not written in legalese, because I've read.
There's no legalese in this book. No.
I've read things written by lawyers.
I read it as a good story and very easy. So there's lots of tables. There's lots of tables.
Let me ask you this, if I may. Since you said you're an attorney, I mean, you're not a trial lawyer though, right?
I do trials.
Okay, because I could imagine easily, if you want to make a case as a lawyer, making a case, and then you pour out your evidence that way, I could see that being very compelling.
Yeah. I sort of did that. I drew on my legal knowledge of how to prove evidence. But I didn't want this to be anything like reading a legal brief. Now, this is actually a very easy read, and I wanted to write a story. So I hired one of the top editors in the country in the historical area, and she was amazing. And so she helped me write. So it's very easy to read. Anyone can read this. Teenagers can read this up to PhDs.
Good. So you've actually tailored it then to people that are. That have a family relationship, or they're immersed in this religion and they have questions. This is the source to go to.
Yes, that's exactly.
Yeah. And so was that your target audience?
My target audience was, yes. I mean, we were sitting around thinking about this because you always want to define your audience. It needed to be everybody. I don't know if no Mormon will read this, and just the general public would like it, would just scholars like it. So I had to put a little bit in for everybody. So I've got the tables, the graphs, the proof for these people who need to see the proof. I got a great story of what happened for those who are interested in the history of Joseph Smith and the Mormons. I got a little bit for everyone. Now, okay. How much time we got left?
Well, normally this would be about 5 more minutes, and I was going to let you pitch however you want.
Okay, I got a great story to close out with.
Okay.
And this is actually the last chapter of my book. So Joseph Smith Jr. was born in 1805, and his parents, Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith. So Lucy Mack, she came from a fairly educated family. Her brother was an international shipping and trader with England, and he also was trying to help Lucy's husband, Joseph Smith Sr., get started in international business, shipping ginseng to China and trading with England. And they traveled around to Philadelphia, Boston, New York. So these weren't country bumpkin farmers up near Rochester. Okay? They were fairly well traveled, and they had access to international shipping through her brother. In the Book of Mormon, there's a story called the Tree of Life. And we all have heard the story Tree of Life and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Well, the Tree of Life in the Book of Mormon is this character named Leah. And when he was in the Holy Land and they were leaving Jerusalem, he saw a vision from God. The vision from God is this tree. This tree had this white glowing fruit on it. And he walks up the tree and eats it. And he says, oh, it tastes really good. He looks down and he sees something called the rod of iron, and leads to a fountain. And there's more to the vision. But what I did was, this vision is copied out of this 1818 Marco Polo book as a coconut tree with an irrigation pipe from some water. And I've traced that in my book. Well, Lucy Smith, when it was in 1858, she wrote her own book after her son died, her husband died, and Brigham Young had gone out to Utah, had the same vision of this tree of life, walk up to the tree and eat this fruit, except she said, my husband had this vision in 1811. Smith Sr. Now, the Book of Mormon is published in 1830. So she says, no, my husband Smith Sr. saw this in 1811. And it wasn't a white fruit. It was white, but it looked like a prickly pear, like a chestnut. Those are the words she used. So I looked and I thought, well, that's odd. Why does she have the same story? Because this was published in 1818. They wasn't even around in 1811. Where'd it come from? Well, I found in this John Pinkerton series, it also had the story Marco Polo. And in this story Marco Polo, there's a story that's not in this version in 1811 of a tree that has a fruit, and guess what the fruit looked like?
Chestnut.
Prickly pear like a chestnut. So, and that was published in, guess what? 1811. The exact date she said that her husband had this vision. And that was also this series that he took out these characters and all these other stories, that same series. So what that told me was, this is Lucy Smith, and it's a confession. And she wrote it in the same way as the Book of Mormon is written, in this coded fashion. But she's saying that it was actually her husband started this in 1811. It wasn't Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was 6 years old at that time, Smith Jr. And that's kind of the surprise ending to my book. It's her expose. Yeah, I was just going to say it. It's her expose of what happened, and I go into my book of why she did this. I think her family members had died, and she was very sorry, actually, for causing all this trouble. And so it's almost her mea culpa. That's what I call it.
All right. Yeah, I knew this was going to be a fun conversation, and it opens up, because my family relationships and everything. I'm thinking about how would people react that I know to the things that you're saying, and I know how the Mormon industry is. I've been at the temple, wandering around the grounds, and I know how people watch you.
Yeah,
it can be a little intimidating the way that they run things, and certainly if you're subject to their rule. It's going to be very, bad situation to be stuck in. And so I have high hopes for the impact that your book, I'm sure, will eventually have, even if people are going to run away from it now. A lot of things happen that way.
That's right.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't see how this could remain the secret that people want it to be right now. They may want to run away from it right now, like mythicism, where like when Wagner came up with the idea of tectonic plates and everybody just scatter. Yeah, but I mean, eventually it comes around. Eventually, people start figuring this out. So, best of luck to you, sir. And of course, links below for anything you want to include, and of course, the Amazon listing for sale of your book.
Right.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Kendal, and have a good night, everybody.